Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar. My name is Serhy Yekelchyk, and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We are a registered charity, and we work to broaden knowledge about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. And we do this by offering discussions with leading experts, scholars on questions of Ukrainian history, culture, and current affairs. I'd like to highlight that we are entirely funded through our events and donations. And so we are extremely grateful to all of you who purchased tickets for tonight's discussion, for tonight's webinar. This sort of support allows us to hold at least some of our events free of charge. Now, let me introduce tonight's webinar. We're launching a new season of events today, and it's the Donbass season. And we hope to discuss in this season, in the different events that we'll organize, the rich culture, a very interesting history, and extremely complex identity of the Donbass. And of course, we will also be discussing the impact of the current war on the population and the region more generally. And this ongoing war that will be the focus of tonight's discussion. I'm sure that most of you here know already that the war has been going on for over 6 years. It started in 2014, so soon after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. According to official estimates, it has already claimed around 14,000 lives. A lot of them are civilians. But if you visited Ukraine before the lockdown, or if you happen to be in Ukraine now, unless you are close to the war zone, unless you are somewhere in the region of Donbass, few things will remind you that this country is at war. At the same time, the impact of this war is felt in every aspect of life in Ukraine. Lots of families, if not most families, have been affected by the ongoing conflict, either through losing someone, knowing someone who lost someone, or through displacement and other hardships. In spite of the duration of this conflict, the understanding of it outside of Ukraine is still quite minimal. Although Russia's aggression against Ukraine has been recognized by the international community, Russia's role in this conflict is still often underestimated. And the war is still often misrepresented as an internal ethnic conflict. So tonight, among other things, we will discuss why this war is still so poorly understood, especially outside of Ukraine, how we can understand the complexity of it better, and how we can situate this conflict in the wider international political context. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Lucy Ash, who will then introduce our speaker, Serhy Yekelchyk. So Lucy Ash is an award-winning broadcast journalist with more than 20 years experience as a BBC correspondent, presenter, and senior producer. Her most recent work includes Ukraine's Frontline Bakery, a radio documentary and film about a new bakery in the town of Mariinka in eastern Ukraine, which is bringing some comfort to local people in the middle of the war. And I highly recommend this documentary to all of you. You can catch it on Radio 4, World Service, and BBC World TV. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and to be speaking to Sergei, who's in the far west of Canada and has hopefully had 1 or 2 morning coffees, so he's relatively wide awake. He's professor of history and Germanic and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria, and he's written very widely about Ukraine and Russian-Ukrainian relations. And he's published Modern Ukrainian History, Ukraine, Birth of the Nation, which was the first historic look at Ukraine that took in the Orange Revolution in 2004. He has also, that's been translated into 5 languages. He's written about how ordinary people behaved during World War II in Stalin's Citizens' Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, which received the Book Award from the American Association of Ukraine Studies. And tonight we're talking about Ukraine, What Everybody Needs to Know, which has just been updated from the 2015 edition. And there's a lot to discuss tonight, not least if you saw the Biden-Trump debate last night, the role that American political horse trading has played in Ukraine. And I mean, who would have thought a few years back that Ukraine would play such a central role in the US elections? But before we get onto those sort of contemporary topics, I want to go back to nuts and bolts and talk a bit about why you wrote the book, Serhy. Your book's called Ukraine, What Everybody Needs to Know. And it's, I have to say, if you haven't read it yet, it's very eloquent, it's very concisely written. And each section starts with a question. Some questions like, was Ukraine really part of Russia? Who are the Cossacks? What is Maidan? And I wanted to ask you first of all, Serhy, if you decided to write this book partly out of a sense of frustration that, you know, this is Europe's second biggest country after Russia, and yet outsiders seem to know relatively little about it.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Lucy, for your introduction, and thank you very much, the Institute, for the invitation. I cannot actually vote in the poll, but if I could, I would have said that I'm joining from the Pacific coast of Canada from a wonderful sunny day. And this is the book in question. Here it is, already available in North America, but it has actually a difficult and long story because the first edition looked more greenish than brownish, the 2015 edition. And what really happened was that I was going on leave and prepared plans to write a history of the Ukrainian Revolution, but a different one. The revolution took place in 1917 to 1921. And ironically, there are numerous parallels between those Ukrainian revolutions, because Russia likewise claimed that it was a civil war, claimed that the Ukrainians really supported a different authority and such. But when Maidan happened and when the Russian aggression took place afterwards, it was really a no-brainer for me that the older project, the project of the revolution, which is 100 years old, had to be postponed. And that is because Oxford called me to ask whether I would consider writing a book for this series. Here is a question I often get. Isn't it a bit too much to use in the title of your book the words, what everyone needs to know? And my answer is, of course, there's a trademark sign here if you look very carefully, and that means this is the names of the series, and the name of the series has been trademarked by Oxford University Press. So I had no choice. And really, it was only the question of what would precede the subtitle, What Everyone Needs to Know. And here, a very interesting evolution took place. The publisher originally wanted me to write a book called The Crisis in Ukraine. And this is what the contract said. But as the crisis, quote unquote, was unfolding, it became increasingly clear to me and the rest of the world, hopefully, that crisis presumed Ukraine's own responsibility for what was going on and excused any external powers from their own responsibility. And then, instead of crisis, I proposed the conflict. And it was indeed about the conflict which allowed me to discuss the Russian aggression in more significant detail, and also to change the framing of the event, because so much of Western media, especially in the United States, was trying to frame it precisely in the crisis mode, so that Ukraine is somehow responsible for the fact that Russia annexed Crimea and sponsored the war in the Donbass. And in the new edition, as you can see, the title has changed yet again. And the reason for that is it's not only the war and the Russian aggression, but it is in fact the new role of Ukraine in the world as a test of the Western democracy, the test of Western ability or perhaps inability to stand by the principles they declare, and the test case really in a wider struggle between two models, one authoritarian conservative model and the other the democratic model represented by the West. So it is not Ukraine's problem as such, but rather it is a problem that Ukraine became the battlefield in a wider global war in which the government of Mr. Putin feels threatened, and for a good reason, by democratic revolutions all around Russia, most recently in Belarus, and before that elsewhere. And Ukrainian case is just the most pronounced of all of these cases, but the struggle is global. And there is one rather unpleasant conclusion resulting from this, namely that the conflict cannot be resolved within Ukraine itself. So no matter what the Ukrainian governments do, they can do a better job or a worse job, but they cannot really solve this problem. Russia itself has to change, or the West has to actually put more pressure on Russia and reach some kind of an agreement. So Ukrainians can stand by to aggression, but they cannot win on their own.
Talking about conflict with Russia, early history is a very hot button topic at the moment. The statue of Prince Vladimir that was put up outside the Kremlin not that long ago was seen as a smack in the face to many people in Kiev, you know, who say that Prince Vladimir is the founder of their nation. And it's almost like a sort of Russia wants to take the founding myth away from Ukraine. And keeps treating it like little Russia, a little brother. Do you think that there's any sense at all in Moscow of the amount of anger that this has caused?
I don't think so. I think the problem is not that the government of Mr. Putin's administration behaves as an international bully, especially in relation to the former Soviet nations and Ukraine in particular. But I don't really see, even in the Russian opposition, a clear understanding that Ukraine is a nation of its own, and any kind of attitudes resembling the colonial past would only anger Ukrainians. It is actually very difficult to hear from major Russian oppositional figures anything about Crimea. So some of them would perhaps say that that was done the wrong way, but still Crimea is Russian, and it's only the next referendum which will formalize things the way they are. There was only one statement really from Ksenia Sobchak saying that according to the international law, Crimea is Ukrainian. She's right, of course. But it takes a lot for a Russian popular figure, media figure, oppositional figure to even acknowledge the most basic facts understood in the world. And on the issue of the origins, I can completely understand the frustration of the imperial nation because they have lost a significant part of a historical narrative. They have lost the holy sites. I'm not sure that Ukraine is so happy to have these holy sites like Kiev, Laura, and some other monasteries which remain to a significant degree centers of pro-Russian ideology. But let's look at it. It's not only the archaeology, it's actually the graves of legendary knights from early Russian history like Ilya Muromets, who is really important for the Russian Empire and for the Russian understanding of how this epic poetry created the new Russian nation in the age of modern nationalism, but his grave happens to be in Kiev. So what do you do in cases like that? And well, that means that you come up with a competing archaeological claim, which is what in fact is happening in Russia, that the first real Russian state was created near Novgorod in Ladoga, and then they sponsor archaeological digs there to prove that Kiev is somehow secondary and less important, that they still have something of this ancient history on the Russian territory. Because it is difficult now to imagine the Russian tourists going to Kiev and recognizing that Ukraine is a different state. Ukraine has its own history, and perhaps Russian history has to be re-examined because it included unfairly some pages of the past which in fact were shared with others, or perhaps even owned predominantly by the others. It's the issue of national pride, but it needs to be understood this way.
Your book sets big store by explaining to people that may not be familiar with what went on, that this is not a question of, as Bush Senior thought, you know, age-old ethnic strife and linguistic divisions, that actually it's a much more complex picture. And I wanted to ask you, because you dedicated the book to your mother-in-law, Anna Yeremina, who you described as a Russian-speaking patriot of Ukraine. I know many people like that. And I wanted to know, like, how did she as a person color your vision of the country and then the conflict that's been tearing it apart?
Yeah, well, like all Ukrainians, I have people in the family and friends who are not of Ukrainian ethnic background, and some of them don't even speak Ukrainian. Also, that is increasingly rare, not having the language. But I think for me, it was the best example that showed the nature of the conflict, the civic nature. That was not along ethnic lines, really, but it was along political lines. Studies have shown that people fighting on both sides of the front are very often speaking the same languages. It is very often Russian. There are plenty of videos being posted on YouTube and elsewhere from the front line, and you realize that not all Ukrainian patriots prepared to die for democratic Ukraine are in fact Ukrainian speaking. But there is a significant difference which separates them from the mercenaries and Russian soldiers and separatists on the other side, and that is the attitude to Stalin and to the Soviet Union more generally. This is really where the division is found. They still adore the Soviet past, whereas on the Ukrainian side, the democratic revolutions, the two of them, and the increasing importance of the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, for the understanding of Ukrainian history, basically produced the effect of combining democratic impulses with that version of history, with the one which treats the Soviet past the way the Soviet past needs to be treated. So it is really then civic and political rather than linguistic and ethnic. I understand completely why the Russian authorities would like to present it the other way around, that it is exclusively about language and identity. Or perhaps the Russian authorities also try and insist that it is really about World War II, because everything in Russia is about World War II these days. So they try to represent the Ukrainian side as a neo-Nazi side, as the side which, in fact, is on the side which had lost in World War II. But this is really way more complex. First of all, World War II is not a major referent on the Ukrainian side at all. It is Russia which forces or trying to force the Ukrainian side into this kind of duality of either select this or that, the black and white version of history. It's actually the Ukrainian Revolution that is more important referent, the event which happened 100 years ago. But also in the Russian version of history, what you get is because the West is constantly wrong. So if you follow the Russian propaganda very closely, you would realize that an average Russian would think that Americans and British and French were on the side of Nazi Germany because they are wrong and the Russians are right. So this is kind of dualistic picture of the world, which I think doesn't reflect at all, even closely, the real developments in international politics and the real position of Russia in the world. But in Ukraine, of course, there is notable hybridity in the versions of memory. And as a scholar of memory, I understand that completely. There was actually a lot written about the Ukrainian government's passing, the Ukrainian parliament passing the bill about national heroes. And I have written about that as well. But the thing is, almost none of the people writing about it mentioned that Russia had passed, just prior to that, its own history laws. And the Ukrainian ones were actually an answer, a direct answer to the Russian legislation. And so this is a war which is conducted by other means as well. It's not only tanks and rockets, but it is in fact conducted in the ideological sphere. And I think on the Ukrainian side, there should be a very clear understanding that they should not get involved and get locked into the binaries Russia would like them to be locked in, but rather they should always reiterate that the heroes of the Heavenly Hundred, those who died during the revolution, were people of various ethnic backgrounds. Perhaps the most famous of them was an Armenian who usually spoke Russian, also he is recorded on video reading a Ukrainian poem. There were Belarusians, there were other people. They varied in professional and ideological background. So they were the civic heroes. And this is the new mythology which Ukraine badly needs, which would take it beyond the binaries, beyond the need to fight Mr. Putin's version of World War II, because everybody understands it's fake history.
Yeah, I mean, talking of civic heroes, the man who put out the tweet that started bringing people into the Maidan was of Afghan heritage, a Ukrainian of Afghan heritage, a very well-known journalist, yeah? But talking of Donbass, it seems that it's a place, from my experience of it, that is neither wholly Russian nor Ukrainian, and that the Soviet past does weigh very heavy there. I remember in Marinka in the park, there are all these photographs of people with medals on their chests who are heroic socialist workers, miners, factory workers. And it feels, sort of talking to a lot of the old people that are trapped there that can't move to Western Ukraine because they're too poor or too ill. They feel very much that they'd like something of their past to be validated, that it's not something that should be sort of written out of the picture.
You are completely right, Lucy. The Donbass is a unique place in Ukrainian history and a very interesting place. And you are right that it does preserve today on the side which is occupied a lot of Soviet elements and Soviet identity. Interestingly enough, it has a coat of arms, which is recognizably Soviet. I'm actually thinking about other places. The separatist republic of Transnistria, which was cut off Moldova, and other places in the former Soviet Union, in fact, also demonstrated allegiance to some kind of idealized Soviet past rather than the Russian present. And the very name of the People's Republics as well. What strikes me here is that they don't seem to understand that Putin's Russia is a very much capitalist state, a state in which communist ideology is not embraced in any way, shape, or form. Lenin is not a hero. Stalin is a hero, but not because of his Marxism, because he created a mighty empire with nuclear warheads. So it seems that they are kind of misled intentionally by the Oven leadership into believing that the Soviet Union still exists in the form of some idealized Russian present, which is completely untrue. But in addition to that, the Donbass is a unique place in that it has changed a lot during the last 100 years. It's the kind of a place where during every war or conflict, people would in fact leave en masse because there would be no work in the mines and the industry would be destroyed. It was rebuilt and repopulated so many times that it went through the whole succession of identities, including a very pronounced Ukrainian identity right after World War II. The Donbass was also a place of migration because it had jobs in good economic times. And young Khrushchev came to Donbass from the neighboring Russian province to join his father, who, like many Russians from that province, was actually employed in the Donbass. Khrushchev left actually a very interesting recollection in his memoirs about seeing the first Jewish pogrom as a teenager in his early teens in the Donbass, and realizing that the workers were trying to defend the Jews from the miners, which sounds mind-boggling to us because we operate in the late Soviet system in which the miners are, of course, the heroes of labor. But in the early 20th century, it is the other way around. It is the workers who are the conscientious people who dress well and read newspapers. But the miners are the recent employees recruited for really tough jobs.
So when you say the workers, do you mean factory workers, or are you talking about people on collective farms?
factory workers, exactly, the working class. And then after World War II, Donbass is so needs to be repopulated, and people are actually recruited in Western Ukraine. So much so that Ukrainian language newspapers have to be created in the Donbass, because a considerable share of working class, more than a half actually, is recently recruited Ukrainians. Moreover, 1/3 of them are women from elsewhere in Ukraine. So you get a completely different Donbass in, let's say, 1947, if it were to be transported there. But of course, this is a very difficult job in the mines. So they try to escape as soon as they can. And so this forever change of circulation of population in the Donbass happens a lot during the 20th century, until the Soviets finally, in the 1960s really, not before that, create this mythology of heroic miner, which produces coal for the entire country and should be rewarded accordingly. So what we are dealing with is actually a very recent construct, which was built by the Soviets and remains powerful today, which I found ironic, because the Donbass is divided by the Russian-Ukrainian border. There are also mines on the Russian part of the border, but nearly all of them are closed now as inefficient, because Russia is a capitalist economy. They have no intention to perpetuate the Soviet mythology of heroic miners. But somehow they like to continue it going on in Ukraine, where mines are equally as inefficient, but in order to be friends with Russia, somehow you have to celebrate the miners, even so the Russian miners are unemployed. So it's one of those ironies of being nostalgic for the present, which is not at all what you think.
Yeah, that's fascinating, actually. I'm thinking about Andrei Kurkov's recent novel, Grey Bees, which is sort of about how everybody's abandoned Donbass, and there are two ex-miners. They're the only guys left in their village, and they hate each other, but they have to be friends because there's no one else around. One of them's an ardent bee collector. But there is, you know, a sense of abandonment. When I was there, the mines weren't working because there was too much fighting in the area. But it seems to me that, in a way, nobody wants Donbass, neither Russia nor Ukraine. Is that true?
So it seems. I'm sure that politicians in Ukraine understand that they would have no choice, really, if Russia were to abandon the Donbass, which is the difficult political choice for Mr. Putin's Russia, because they practice bully politics, macho politics. So it would make damage to Mr. Putin's personal reputation if they were to withdraw the troops from the Donbass and quote unquote abandon the Donbass. But it is true that the electoral map of Ukraine has been changed in radical ways, with the Crimea gone and that part of the Donbass gone. It became very different. So it's kind of telling that Mr. Zelenskys' stunning victory in both presidential and parliamentary elections was not connected in any way to a pro-Russian agenda. It is just that he de-emphasized the importance of Ukrainian language and other such things. But he was not running on the pro-Russian agenda, and the pro-Russian forces are increasingly marginalized in Ukraine. Also, they may be making a comeback a little bit precisely because of the way Mr. Zelensky manages culture and politics of memory and other things. But yes, there is a strong sense, you are completely right, that is better without the Donbass. But here, we have to show, I think, that the Ukrainian identity as it developed after the two revolutions is a democratic, civic, and inclusive identity, that we care about the people of the Donbass, those who are not involved in crimes against humanity and fighting against democratic Ukraine, and there will be a way eventually to incorporate it back, and perhaps in a generation or 2 generations to make it the Donbass of a new democratic era. For that, quite obviously, Mr. Putin would have to remove his mercenaries and his contract soldiers. And it is quite telling also that I think late last year, Russia increased 5-fold the number of offices issuing Russian passports to the residents of the Donbass. I think they realize that at some future point, they would have to remove the people involved into any atrocities. and they want to start early. And I think realistically, we can speak for now that Ukraine doesn't want Donbass back, but you cannot make it a position in principle, because Ukraine should not surrender its territory or its people, no matter how confused, right? So Ukraine has changed since independence. Donbass has changed as well, not always in the right direction. But the majority of the population in the Donbass, in the two provinces, was in fact ethnic Ukrainian, according to the last Soviet census. It is just that the majority also spoke Russian as the home language, but they didn't register the Russian ethnic identity in the census, which is telling, and which I think also imposes certain obligations on all Ukrainian governments. You cannot really openly speak of a principled position of abandoning the Donbass, no matter what Russia sponsored there, because there will be procedures quite obviously at the end of this conflict to make sure that criminals are not allowed back into Ukraine. But so far, Ukraine has a dismal record also dealing with crimes against humanity, including the Maidan, on the Maidan as well. So I understand the way it should be, but I do have, like yourself, my doubts that Ukrainian governments are prepared, especially now, for any incorporation of the Donbass in the short run.
Were you personally surprised by how quickly hostility built up and fighting broke out there?
No. I have to say that other Ukrainian provinces, but especially Odessa and Kharkiv, and these two large cosmopolitan cities, after which they are named, were just as viable candidates for pro-Russian insurgency and the actual invasion and an attempt to proclaim a separatist republic. Perhaps Dnipro, previously known as Dnipropetrovsk, was another good candidate. And it is really a combination of local circumstances that prevented it. Because what really happened was that the two major parties in Ukraine in the 2000s, after the collapse of the Communist Party, because previously the Donbass and the Crimea were really the stomping ground of the Communist Party. It owned them, so they could dictate anything. But when the Communist Party collapsed in the 2000s, which was to a significant degree a generational process, then the Party of Regions came to dominate in the exact same provinces. And for the Party of Regions, it could not use the communist rhetoric. So it had to emphasize then the quote unquote defense of the Russian speakers and the traditional connections to Russia. And so in the course of decades, it became a major electoral issue, which I think the Ukrainian parties mistakenly accepted, that it is really about Russia. And what then happened was that the Party of Regions thought it had a beautiful slogan on which it could run the elections forever, without in fact making any serious investments, because you see the issue of ties with Russia is much cheaper for them than, let's say, increasing the pensions or any other social programs. It's so much easier to argue over the language. And I think some Ukrainian parties mistakenly got locked into this struggle too, also perhaps thinking that it is much cheaper to argue about the language than fix major social issues or urban infrastructure or whatever. And then they didn't realize that there is right next door a powerful neighbor who owns these issues. So because the Party of the Regions prepared the ground, it was so easy for Mr. Putin to march in and basically implicitly say, well, if you are so much in defense of the Russian language and historical ties with Russia, why would you even bother with the Party of Regions when the Russia is here, the Russia of Mr. Putin? So why don't you then become Russian? And what then happened was that people realized the cultural agenda of the Party of Regions, and before that of the Communist Party of Ukraine, and to a significant degree the Socialist Party of Ukraine as well in the 90s, was in fact something that would qualify today as treason. But we just didn't realize it until Russia, in fact, started an open aggression. It seemed to be a legitimate part of debate in Ukraine, but it was to a significant degree shaped by the Russian propaganda, but we didn't know back then that you had to look for Russian propaganda and manipulation. And we didn't know back then that the Russian tanks would roll in, taking advantage of all these notions already established in certain region. In fact, I sincerely hope that the Ukrainian governments would never repeat the mistake which was made with the Crimea. Namely, when the Crimean crisis of the early 1990s was solved, it was solved on the platform of leaving the Crimea to the Crimean elites to run. And treating the Crimean autonomy, which was restored, by the way, by independent Ukraine, not for the Crimean Tatars, but for the local elites, for the Russian speakers in Crimea. And that was a terrible historical mistake. And then, of course, instead of saying, well, you cannot say really that Crimea is Russian. It may well be today, but this is the result of a genocide. Russians became a majority in Crimea overnight in 1944 when Stalin had deported the Crimean Tatars. So instead of that, the Ukrainian position in the 1990s was in fact making a deal with the Crimean bureaucracy, which back then was dominated by the Communist Party. And thus creating a forepost or kind of a fortress for the Russian identity in the Crimea. And now we realize that these things that seem to be related to culture, to power balance, to this and that, and the authorities are always busy with something else. But then the war comes, and you realize that you have helped actually to prepare the annexation of Crimea by not investing in the Ukrainian identity in Crimea, by not supporting the Crimean Tatars properly. And I see that the Ukraine of President Poroshenko, for instance, reversed this course very obviously. But it's difficult for me to see whether the Zelensky administration would follow up on that, or whether they're just basically given up on Crimea, which would also be a mistake.
Yes. I mean, I wondered also to what extent people in Donbass thought that they were going to benefit, that they had an idea that pensions would go up, the standard of living would go up. They didn't think about the fact that the cost of goods in the shops would also go up, but they had some sort of idea that they would be bankrolled by Russia. And it seems from what I've seen, I was in Crimea a few months after the takeover, and already there was a lot of disillusionment setting in. And it's got a lot worse since then, I think.
That's my understanding as well, yeah. Because people were lured into it by the implicit or sometimes explicit promises of a better standard of life. But they were not prepared for war or for dictatorship, for that matter. And I think most complaints in Crimea today are really about the way the Russian officials behave there. Kind of wrestling land plots from the locals and basically arriving with big money to buy everything, to buy out everything. So the Crimeans were not prepared for that. But perhaps more important, I don't think that Donbass was prepared for the war and for a long frozen conflict with a kind of low intensity fighting, which would go on for years. We know there are indications that people in the Donbass are trying to maintain various options, especially for their children, because it is important for the children, for instance, to go to college. So they have to maintain Ukrainian identity as well, to receive some of the documents on the Ukrainian side and send the kids to study at Ukrainian universities, which some colonists in Ukraine feel that this is a mistake, that we are accepting the kids from the Donbass. But
you mean from the DNR or from Luhansk?
Precisely. But I think it should be state policies that not only they are accepted, but they are encouraged actually to study in Ukraine. Because it is not an easy choice for them, and to cross this internal border is always a colossal headache. And perhaps they are putting families at risk, but in any case, they are showing their willingness to be part of Ukraine. So they not only should be accepted by, encouraged by the state, which I don't think is happening now.
Changing the subject a bit, yesterday you were telling me there's a reason why I couldn't find a copy of your book in Waterstones or online. It's only available from December, but you can get it in the States.
That was a surprise to me, actually, to discover very late after the book has already arrived, actually, here. So I had my own copy, but the press sent me an email notifying me very late that they have a very interesting policy. They decided to rush the book to the printers in North America, but not elsewhere in the world. And the reason for that is the American presidential election, because Ukraine came up repeatedly in the course of this extremely long and very strange contest between the Democratic and Republican candidates. As your listeners no doubt know, Mr. Trump ended up being impeached by the Congress because of a phone call he made and because of the favor he asked of President Zelensky. But also the Trump side was, of course, using the activities of Joe Biden and his son Hunter in Ukraine as a pretext for Senate investigation, which has been concluded just a few days before, really. So Ukraine is an issue on both sides. And already during this presidential campaign, there was an attempt by one pro-Russian parliamentarian in Ukraine to release the secret recordings of phone calls between the American officials, including Biden and the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and the Ukrainian President Poroshenko. In Ukraine, everybody is recording everyone as well. So it's just crazy world of political manipulation and blackmail. So that was not surprising in itself. What was surprising was how little there was in the recordings which could possibly be interpreted against Biden or Kerry for that matter. They really revealed one strange thing, that the American officials were micromanaging Ukrainian politics. But that is an interesting indication. It means they understand the importance of Ukraine strategically in Europe and vis-a-vis Russia as well. But they are frustrated with Ukrainian politicians, and they have to micromanage to a significant degree to the point of making phone calls to another party to make sure that people vote for something, or to make sure that somebody can join the government. It was stunning. And the Russian press tried to present it as yet another proof that Ukrainian fascists are in fact the puppets of American capitalists. But the thing is, what it really shows is that Ukraine is an enormously important test case for democracy and economic transformation. And also the case which is not yet a complete success at all, which requires enormous attention of the West. And it also means Ukraine is on the map of people like Trump, who would not, I think, be able to show too many countries on the map in their correct locations, but they know where that Ukraine is there, and you can dig dirt on every politician who ever visited Ukraine, which Mr. Trump perhaps knows from his own experience after his trips to Russia, right? But the thing is, Ukraine has acquired this not entirely pleasant reputation in the West, and especially in the United States, that if you make a phone call, or like Mr. Trump's personal lawyer, the billionaire Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, was making trips to Ukraine and meeting with local politicians who gladly took pictures with him, and he was trying to collect evidence against the Bidens and to collect the evidence which would help the Trump campaign. And I felt terrible when seeing these pictures in my newsfeed on Facebook and elsewhere, because it felt almost like a colonial attitudes are being perpetuated. Like for centuries, when visiting foreigners felt, oh, well, this is a little Russia. It's a province of Russia, which is populated by funny people who dance and sing and drink vodka and such. Well, these kind of colonial overtones are very much, I think, present in the American political discourse. Whereas in reality, Ukraine is a ground of two very recent and successful civic revolutions. It can also be the case that the United States are on the verge of their own civic revolution. And I keep repeating to my colleagues doing American history that they should study the Ukrainian example. If Mr. Trump refuses to go, this is what you do. This is how you organize civic disobedience and how you push the government to accept the reality that it can no longer stay in power, no matter what. So it's a very different Ukraine. And it was also kind of terrible to see it as a place which is seen as embodiment of corruption. Whereas in fact, in Ukraine, the independent journalists and some government agencies, journalists are losing their lives, really, because they're fighting against corruption. That doesn't happen in the United States all that often. So the Ukrainian example is actually a heroic story. A heroic story because it deals with the problems the American society doesn't want to see in itself. And perhaps I could even generalize wider that the West doesn't want to see in its own record. So it prefers to be in a position of a teacher, but without investing much into this teaching program.
So you think it's mainly a case of finger wagging?
It is. It is.
What do you make of Zelenskys' first year in power? Well, he's a bit more than a year now, but how well has he done, do you think? He has been put in a very difficult situation by the Americans, for sure.
Very much so. But also, I think, by his own inexperience and his stated principle of not involving people previously in politics. That sold very well to the Ukrainian voters that don't use politicians from any previous periods or people who had been to the parliament. But what happened also was that he started operating by the models he was familiar with. So lawyers from entertainment industry suddenly became prominent in the administration, but I don't think they were prepared for the understanding of the complexities of the Ukrainian case. He had the advice of former diplomats, so he kind of managed the Trump crisis more or less successfully. When the recordings of the phone call were released, everybody felt like, oh, he sounds so subservient to Mr. Trump, so desperate to please the American president. But this is not a sin. This is the cards he had been dealt, right? So he has no choice, really, because of his weak position and the weak position of his country. He really needs the American support and the Western support more widely against Russia. But the thing is...
so you mean if he started sycophantic, he could be forgiven?
I think so. From the point of view of the Ukrainian citizen, if the country is at war, and people are dying on the front line, and Russia has theoretically the capacity to organize a massive frontal attack if it wanted. So the Ukrainian army was under Poroshenko, the Ukrainian army was built into a fighting force, which it previously was not. So it can stand its ground in the Donbass, but it's only because not the entire Russian forces are involved. So if a major conflict were to happen, Ukraine would need help. It would need it very badly. Help was real and symbolic. Like, for instance, it was a big item in the news, the sale of Javelin missiles, the permission given by Mr. Trump to sell offensive lethal weapons to Ukraine, like Javelin anti-tank missiles. And everybody talked about it. But the thing is, Ukraine produces its own equivalent of javelins. That was not widely reported anywhere, which is quite good actually, may even be better in some respects. But the thing is, it was important symbolically. If the United States and the American allies are taking you seriously, selling you the lethal weapons, and also, as you know, the UK, Canada, and the US are the three anchors of the program of training the Ukrainian army in the training field on the Polish border, just the opposite side of the country from the conflict. And that is important, not because of the training they get, which is a big plus, but because of the fact that there's uniformed personnel of these three major players and other European players as well, who participate in the training program, being present on the Ukrainian soil. And then, of course, there is a question of Mr. Zelensky in this phone call dismissing any assistance Ukraine was receiving from the European Union and prominent donors from the European Union. And it wasn't understood in Ukraine, I think, precisely the way it had to be understood, as a kind of rhetorical device designed to please Mr. Trump's enormous ego. That is only you, because you are so big and, you know, kind-hearted, that you support Ukraine, and the rest of them, they are not serious. They just all talk, which caused, I think, serious reaction from France in particular, and also from Germany to some degree, because the reality is the participation in negotiations, and negotiations are of course stalled. It's an enormously difficult process in which it's very easy to run into problems, which Poroshenko as a former foreign minister understood very well. But sometimes you need to go into the procrastination mode because you wouldn't win otherwise. You would end up in a difficult situation. And I think the Zelensky administration, which ran the elections on the slogan of restarting the Minsk peace process, just started with a few blunders. And it was the reaction of the opposition in Ukraine, people basically demonstrating before the office of the president with protesting slogans, that helped put Zelensky's line more into the direction of Ukraine's interests. So they do run into all kinds of problems connected to the way this administration naively perceives kind of a new, fresh approach as being necessary in all fields. That brought them short-term success with elections, but as we know, the popularity of Zelensky has been declining slowly. It's still remarkable because 1 year after, still 1/3 of Ukrainians feel that he's the most popular politician, he is the best promise, which is very remarkable because Ukrainians do tend to get disillusioned with presidents early on. But it's also remarkable, I should say, that former President Poroshenko managed to stage a comeback, a political comeback, not like anything we have seen in Ukrainian history before that. To come back, to the parliament and basically become a major force which united patriotic Ukrainians around it. It's quite an achievement.
Is it partly born out of a frustration that Mr. Zelensky seems to be so frightened of antagonizing Putin?
It is the perception. Zelensky, of course, is dealing with a political heavyweight. Mr. Putin is a very experienced person. He has been trained to manipulate people, for God's sake. And it seems that his relationship with Mr. Trump in particular, and perhaps with some European leaders as well, without naming names, is actually unfolding according to the KGB handbook of how to manipulate and influence people. But also, by now, Mr. Putin is a very experienced statesman who has studied the weaknesses of the West and knows exactly when to insert a dissenting note which would work. And of course, Mr. Zelensky is extremely inexperienced in comparison to them. But there's also the bigger fact that he is dependent on the West, that he cannot really make demands on Russia, whereas Russia can and does constantly make demands on the West and on Ukraine, constantly. So it's not an equal competition there. But as I said at the very start of our conversation, it's also not really the Ukrainian problem. It's not the Ukrainian crisis. And there was a very telling sign when Mr. Putin decided to get involved in Syria. Suddenly, fighting subsumed on the Ukrainian front. There were not too many people killed per week. And this is because Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, North Korea, they're all parts of this network in which Mr. Putin is engaging with the West. And that is his big struggle. Not Ukraine per se, but actually, it can also be the same mercenaries and the same special forces Russian personnel which is fighting, that has been shown, at least in 2 cases, I think, that the same people previously recorded in Ukraine fighting as allegedly the volunteers from the Donbass are in Syria fighting as allegedly the Russian volunteers there. So it is part of a global game. It's not the Ukrainian crisis.
But it is a proxy war in some ways.
It is a proxy war. It is a proxy war, and that is extremely unfortunate for Ukraine, I think, because you cannot really win in a proxy war because you are not strong enough. You can, however, try to wait it over or exploit the contradictions between the major partners. That worked in the 1990s for President Kuchma, who subsequently acquired a terrible reputation in Ukraine because of corruption, manipulation, killing journalists and all kinds of things. But in the, I think, mid to late 90s, he was quite successful exploiting the tensions between Russia and the West, to kind of threatening to join the NATO, threatening to do this, to do that, actually extracting from a Russian President Yeltsin a major treaty, not just on the status of Crimea and the division of the Black Sea Fleet, but also on the recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty in its present borders. And of course, Mr. Putin violated this treaty like he violated many other treaties and keeps violating these treaties. But kind of smart, long-term foreign policy, like the one Poroshenko pursued under very difficult circumstances. The situation was considerably more difficult for Poroshenko. He was facing military defeats, right? Ilovaisk. He was facing Russia, which was lying to the West. Not a strong commitment from the West to helping Ukraine, but he did manage to win great many diplomatic wars. And when the moment came to start procrastinating, which was the case with Steinmeier formula on how to proceed to peace in the Donbass, he understood that well, that Ukraine also needs to procrastinate sometimes because some Western partners are misguided in their good wishes and they don't realize what the elections would produce if they are conducted under the conditions of the Russian control over the Donbass. You cannot really run free elections there, no matter what Mr. Putin says, because he is not running free elections either in Russia, right? And that Russian deception goes on far in history, back to Lenin and Stalin. And of course, Stalin had promised to Roosevelt and Churchill in Yalta very famously that he would held democratic elections in Poland and other East European countries. And of course, he had a different understanding of democratic elections. What a democratic election is when 99% vote for Comrade Stalin. And if you don't, then you get arrested. So he had that kind of democratic elections in Eastern Europe, as explained fairly well in Anne Applebaum's book on the Cold War in Eastern Europe. So the West seems to be walking over and over again into the same trap. And the Ukrainian policy should then be of constantly pointing out what the issue is. And I think this is happening, and especially because the Russian authorities keep running into problems of poisoning people in the UK or right there in Russia. And this doesn't sit well with the way West understands politics.
Yes, well, that's certainly true. I think that we ought to open up to questions in a minute. I just want to ask you one more thing, which is, you know, I wonder what you think the long-term effect is on the psychology of people that have suffered immensely to change the regime in their country, you know, the sheer fortitude during the Orange Revolution and then Euromaidan, and then they're waiting for a knight in shining armor who constantly disappoints. I mean, do you feel that Ukrainians are becoming more cynical in a way?
Fortunately, no. I would have expected this outcome, absolutely. And after every revolution, actually after the Orange Revolution in 2005, there were extremely high expectations. But the winners of the revolution, the political winners, managed to disappoint Ukrainians fairly soon. After the Revolution of Dignity, that happened again. But Ukrainians are surprisingly resilient in this. They just bounce back. And they are prepared to go and demonstrate and to remind the authorities what the ideals of the revolution are really. And I found it enormously promising that after Mr. Zelenskys' victory, a democratic patriotic opposition to him managed to organize so promptly. So promptly, even so, Poroshenko was not an ideal figure. He was the previous president whose popularity was not very high. Some things he had promised to do, he only did after being defeated, such as passing the language legislation, for instance. But he was immediately forgiven for this and more because the Ukrainian citizens felt that they needed a platform for the promotion of civic and democratic values of the revolution. And a platform to remind Zelenskys administration that Russia is the opposite of that, of these values. And therefore, all these promises to conclude quick peace can only be achieved at the price of kind of returning into the Russian fold, because it wouldn't work any other way with Mr. Putin. And that seemed to be a very good promise. The Ukrainian society bounces back all the time. It is very resilient. It is disillusioned after the revolution does not result in immediate improvements. But also we have to remember that the Revolution of Dignity was followed right away by the Russian annexion of the Crimea and the war in the Donbass by the Russian aggression on all fronts. It's enormously difficult to pursue any reform agenda under the circumstances. So Zelensky tried to distinguish himself from Poroshenko by doing certain things when he acquired full control of the parliament, when his party won complete majority, didn't need any coalitions. One of the issues, by the way, which Poroshenko did not address and was not widely reported in the West, was passing the legislation on the sale of land. And that is very promising because the Ukrainian state can benefit from the tax on any transactions with land. And the reason why no previous Ukrainian government attempted to pass this legislation and specifically blocked any legislation on the sale of land was that the Ukrainian ruling class really enjoyed renting cheaply rather than buying for a significant sum. And then when you rent, you don't own much to the state. But if you buy, the state gets significant tax on the purchase. So the oligarchs and the new rich, whichever party is in power, and of course, what was embarrassing that the parties were using extreme nationalistic rhetoric. If you allow the sale, foreigners could buy. So does it mean that you want our own billionaires to get even richer? Yeah. But your rhetoric is ostensibly socialist, but the beneficiaries are the billionaires. So Zelensky did that. And that is a big plus early on for him. But it remains to see whether the system works, because Ukraine has multiple ways of bypassing all kinds of taxes and legislation and such. But one can see that he had some good intentions, but he probably didn't realize just how to make them work.
Yeah, well, he had a staggering legacy of corruption to deal with. Okay, well, let's open it up to questions. I think Yulia Chikolba will ask her question live. So, Yulia, are you okay to unmute yourself to ask your question?
I wanted to ask you basically, in a legal, like internationally, we have almost exclusively one legal concept of foreign countries to intervene, military intervene in other countries' affairs, like responsibility to protect. Do you think annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass was actually good enough reason to do so and to establish, let's say, for UN or other organizations, any kind of peacekeeping mission? Probably that's what we as Ukrainians were kind of hoping for, but was it really enough? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, probably you can suggest some kind of other international legal concept for more, let's say, stronger move from international community to support Ukraine as a definitely a bit weaker part of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, rather than just deep concern as we used to hear. Thank you.
Are you happy
Thank you
with
very
that?
much. Can I go on?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yulia. It's a good question. I wish I were an international lawyer. I don't have much expertise in international law, but I actually agree with you that this is not enough. That it is very clear that Russia is an aggressor. Even so, it denies officially its involvement in the Donbass, but the Crimean case is telling enough in and of itself. But I think the Western position is really informed by historical precedent, namely by the precedent of the Baltic states, when in 1940, the Soviet Union annexed Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, according to its agreement with Hitler. The West didn't recognize that, and the West famously continued to refuse recognizing these lands as Soviet republics throughout the existence of the Soviet Union, which allowed these republics actually to maintain diplomatic representation in the Western capitals. And I think actually London was the place where these diplomats were resident. But that example, that model is actually problematic in many respects. It just means we refuse to recognize it as your acquisition, but we don't do much about it, or we cannot do much about it. It's the practice of waiting over until this is over, which paid off in the case of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia at the cost of immeasurable suffering for these people who underwent deportations, Soviet security operations, Sovietization, collectivization, all kinds of things. And I think the Western example is really informed by this. They wouldn't want to antagonize Russia too much because Russia is really important for the economic well-being, especially of European countries. Should I say, especially for the UK? Just to make a comment on our host city and host country here in this conversation. We know from the leaks from the United States State Department that the Americans see it as a difficult process of keeping the Europeans in line with the policies of kind of taking measures against Russia. So we know that some European partners of the United States are less than willing to continue them. There is also apparently pressure behind the scenes on Ukraine for a deal. And allegedly, according to unconfirmed reports everybody keeps denying, the nature of the deal would involve recognizing that Crimea is Russian, but Russia then surrendering the Donbass. And that would allow some Western countries to drop sanctions on Russia, because most sanctions were actually linked to the annexation of the Crimea, not so much to the fighting in the Donbass. The Crimea was the big one for sanctions, right? So if there is behind the scenes pressure on Ukraine to potentially consider a deal like that, I wouldn't be looking forward to the West developing more coherent or more radical policy of pressuring Russia, but rather holding the line would be good, because there are definitely forces within the European Union that would want to drop the sanctions and to keep trading with Russia like nothing has ever happened and life is beautiful. This, I think, is a problem. On this side of the Atlantic, in both the United States and Canada, Ukraine has bipartisan support, or actually in Canada, three partisan support. So all the major parties, no matter who is in power, are committed to assisting Ukraine to the degree possible. So they cannot, for a variety of reasons, even reconsider this. And they don't have much trade with Russia these days anyway, Canada in particular. But it's very different in Europe, where Mr. Putin's manipulations are more considerable. And the Russian trolls are all over the internet, and there is Russian funding for radical right parties in some countries. And there are Russian connections yet to be explored among Western politicians as well. Some media outlets are owned by Russian oligarchs. So I'm afraid we are not at the stage of looking forward towards more radical measures against Russia, but we are rather at the stage of holding the line and making sure that no European country breaks the ranks and says, no, it was enough. Let's give Mr. Putin our full permission to trade in everything. There are multiple examples of that as well. So I would be very careful. And I'm also worried about Mr. Zelensky.
I think you've frozen a bit, Serhy. Shall I ask for the next question, which is Andrei Smitsnyuk?
But I side with you completely on what you've said.
Hello?
Hello.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I would like to thank both the moderator and the speaker for this wonderful interview and say that I enjoyed the book a lot and looking forward to the second one. And I actually have two questions. The first one being is how the ideology of Ruski Mir shaped the conflict in Donbass, and how many people do actually you think believe it living there right now? And the second one is why do Minsk agreements in normative format fail to stop the war, and what do Ukrainian authorities, in your opinion, have to do to make it work? And if you could possibly recommend any readings on these two questions of Russian propaganda of Ruski Mir and Minsk II and its effectiveness.
Thank you. These are great questions, Andrei. Thank you so much. They're also difficult to answer because all the great questions are difficult to answer. So on the ideology of Ruski Mir, I think, especially in the last years of Yanukovych, it was de facto accepted as the new state line by the Yanukovych government. They started doing what was a trademark thing of Ruski Mir, reenactments of World War II and reenactments of Soviet military parades when even small kids are dressed in uniforms of the Red Army around 1945. They actually had a parade like that on Khreshchatyk during the late Yanukovych period. The city of Luhansk, one of the two capitals of the Donbass, was really big on that. So it's the moment when this cult of World War II understood in the Soviet-Russian version of Great Patriotic War is linked to the issue of the Russian language and historical friendship with Russia, you have the complete picture of Ruski Mir. Because by linking them, you also implicitly assign a place for the idea of independent Ukraine. Independent Ukraine, or anything connected to the promotion of the Ukrainian language, would then be Banderite, connected to the Ukrainian nationalists during World War II period and after. And
just for people that don't know, you're talking about Stefan Bandera, yeah?
Stefan Bandera, precisely, yes. Which, by the way, is a figure much more complex than it is presented in the Russian propaganda, right? Not that I justify his actions or anything, or all of his actions in any case, or the ideology of Ukrainian nationalism, which was an ideology of that time, of the 1930s and 40s. And it had all the features you would expect from the ideologies of that day. But when this Russian mythology of World War II and everybody who is the enemy being connected to the Nazis in some way, including, as I said earlier, ironically, the West implicitly being connected to the Nazis, because every statement Mr. Putin issues on World War II has the West as being responsible for the war. Most recently, Poland was responsible for starting World War II and such. So this ideology made an entrance into the Ukrainian mainstream under Yanukovych. And some of us in the West found it very troublesome, watching that parade on Khreshchatyk and reenactments in Luhansk, because it was no longer the issue of whether the Russian speakers are fully accommodated with an independent Ukrainian state, but it was now that the very idea of independent Ukraine was opposite to the concept of the universal good found on the Russian side, allegedly, in the Great Patriotic War. So that ideology was, and I believe remains fairly influential in other centers of Ukraine, such as Kharkiv and Odessa, I already named. Not so much
should
in
we
Kyiv.
move on to the question now from Lesia, surely?
I have to answer the second part very quickly.
You seem to have got a bit stuck. Are you out of that now? Yeah. You didn't answer the point about Minsk.
I will.
Agreement. Yeah. Hello? Are we losing you? Hi, Serhy.
Okay.
Okay.
Leslie, I can see you.
Yes. You were going to just answer the second part of that question about the Minsk agreement.
Very quickly. There's a good reason why they don't work. That is because Ukraine would have preferred to have other partners at the table as well. The Americans in particular.
Your internet connection isn't working very well. Do you think maybe you should log on again?
And the peace plan proposed in Minsk by Steinmeier is disadvantageous for Ukraine. Poroshenko had to accept it in the aftermath of a defeat at Ilovaisk.
Let's get Lesia to ask her question. Lesia, can you ask your question, please? Can I unmute you?
Yes. Hi. Good evening. Thank you so much. This is really useful. You always think you know a lot about Ukraine, and then you learn some more. I was recently reading Peter Conradi's book, Who Lost Russia, which was put out in 2017, and it makes the argument that, of course, the West lost its golden moment, as it were, to deal with Putin in a positive way, such to encourage him in the right direction. I'm not sure I buy that thesis, but it certainly after a point into his second term, he became far more aggressive and paranoid and everything else. But as late back as, or as early as 1991, I had written a thesis about the fact that without Russia actually realizing its own national narrative and its own identity, which was separate from the colonial one from Tsarist times and also separate from the Soviet experience, that Ukraine would always be threatened, its independence would always be threatened, because the Russia needed its own narrative. So I just wanted to ask whether you think that if it will ever be possible for the Russians to create their own identity that's separate from the imperial one, and also whether or not Ukraine's will always be threatened in its survival.
I'm afraid so. It's actually, the moment was probably lost in 1991. There was a brief window when President Yeltsin and his advisors felt that Ukraine could go. But it's also because they were hoping that Ukraine would not go too far. It would remain a friend of Russia and in the Russian sphere of influence. I don't think there was ever a moment under Mr. Putin when Western influence would have reversed that. Putin's very agenda from the very start, but even under late Yeltsin period, in the late 1990s, it was already extremely difficult for Russia to acknowledge the separate identity of Ukraine. And Kuchma had to use blackmail with joining the NATO and such. Not under Mr. Putin. I find it significant, though, that this is the illusion often discussed in the West. That it is somehow the West's responsibility and not Mr. Putin's responsibility, that the West needed to placate a dictator and authoritarian regime. So there is a problem with that. The moment, though, there is one thing which is worth considering. Russia did not invade the Donbass in 1991, right? It invaded the Donbass in 2014. And there was a moment in the 1990s when perhaps a beneficial Western pressure and influence could have produced the results. But I wouldn't guarantee even that, because really, the American administrations until Clinton tried that. They tried to investing into democratic Russia. They had special programs to fund democratic transformations and such, but Russia started right away making claims about the Crimea, not about the Donbass, but about the Crimea. What I think what happened, that Russia was placated by not the West, but by the understanding that Ukraine is not really a separate country. They did not require foreign passports to cross the border. But basically, life continued as before. Russians would go on vacation in Crimea. So it took the realization that Ukraine is separate for the war to start, really. So we know from the experience of other empires that it can be very long and painful. So I'm not really optimistic on that. It will take a generation or more. And also it depends on whether Mr. Putin's term ends in some way, either political or kind of physical, during the economic crisis or during the good economic times in Russia. So we don't really know what happens after Mr. Putin. And there are fully justified fears that what comes after Putin would be just as authoritarian.
We're having all sorts of technical challenges today. We seem to have lost Lucy, but I'm really hoping that she will be able to log back in soon. If not, I will take over for the remaining 9 minutes or so. But here's a question from Emily Jamala, please.
Yes, this is definitely a crystal ball question, given the complexities that you've so wonderfully articulated. Given all of the history and the current status, what do you see as potential scenarios for the future of the Ukraine relationship with the EU?
That is the question of questions, because what happened in the Baltic states, of course, was that there was strong opposition of local Russians living in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania to becoming part of Europe. But once they did, the states joined the European Union, the children of those Russians who protested and such and defended Soviet monuments, the children were only too happy to discover that a passport of one of those states allows them to travel and work anywhere in Europe. And when that happened, all the struggles actually acquired a different context. And this new generation of Russians may still be holding views somewhat resembling of the Ruski Mir, but they are really discovering what it means to be European. And I think it takes perhaps another generation for them to become very different. And I do notice that Russians living outside of Russia tend to be easier to talk about Russian politics. Now in Ukraine, the problem is that the European Union is not in fact offering Ukraine any accession path at all. This is what the Russian propaganda keeps telling us, that Ukraine is being lured into the European Union, but that's not the fact, unfortunately. The European Union only offered the association agreement and, after much bargaining, a visa-free regime, which is constantly threatened because every time the Ukrainian parliament does something, the ambassadors just say, oh, we are going to withdraw the visa-free travel. And then the Ukrainian parliamentarians are back in line. But there is no clear path to accession, or to the NATO for that matter. It's only the cooperation within certain frameworks and treaties. And also, of course, the European Union, there is another claimant for a seat at the European table, and that is Turkey, which is the EU is unwilling and perhaps even unable to accept. So accepting Ukraine would create multiple issues. So I kind of understand the European position, but it also means that the issue of Europe or European Ukraine has become a metaphor. That's what it is. So when Ukrainians say we want to be part of Europe, they do not necessarily mean to become members of the European Union, but rather to live like Europeans. Idealized Europeans, right? Kind of democratic, free market, equal opportunity, not the kind of Europeans they sometimes encounter near their own borders, the xenophobic, there are other examples in Europe, sometimes very close to Ukraine, that are not part of that ideal. So the European Union functions as a dream, and the European Union is aware of that. There are scholarly works about Europe as an idea which helps promote transformations in countries that would like to become part of Europe. But I don't see it in the nearest future, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have listeners on YouTube asking questions, and so I'd like to bring one of them. You partly answered some of the three questions, you partly answered one of them on the relationship with Europe and the future prospects for Ukraine to enter European Economic Community. And another question is about the future of Donbass. And the listener is saying, do you think that Donbass might end up being part of Russia or as a satellite? And will Ukraine let that situation happen?
I don't think so. Russia really likes maintaining separatist republics inside the states, which are for some reason gravitating towards the West, which is the case with Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and Moldova as well. And by the way, the reason why Russia had helped create a separatist entity within Moldova in the early 90s, but not in Ukraine, was precisely the perceived danger that Moldova would join the West sooner by becoming part of Romania. This is why the Russian, basically, military intervention happens there. But they don't really like incorporating these things into Russia at all, because that would lose the moment of bargaining. And the way it is, it's more difficult for these countries to get accepted into the NATO, for instance, because the NATO doesn't like territorial claims and such. So the current situation is good for Russians, for the Russian government. They like it quite a bit. The Crimea is different. It's a different matter. But the Donbass, I don't think it will be incorporated. I think what is going to happen, if I were to project, is that they would issue Russian passports freely to whoever wanted to take them. But of course, people know by now that if you try to leave for Russia from the Donbass, you may end up in rather undesirable parts of Russia and without a good steady job. And it's still the Russian bureaucracy you have to deal with. So some people could in fact be reluctant. The Russian press was saying millions would apply, but then the numbers were not really impressive either. So I think there would be a process to remove the people who committed crimes or would not want to be part of Ukraine under any circumstances. And then Donbass can be technically incorporated into Ukraine at some future point.
Thank you. I can see that Lucy is back, and while she's settling, we really need to start wrapping up very soon, but may I just bring another question from the Q&A that an anonymous attendee asked, and that's about Ukraine's role in Belarus. What do you think is Ukrainian role in Belarus, if there is any?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a very prominent role. But what I think is happening in Belarus, you'd remember this photograph, which was reproduced by Western media very widely, of the Western ambassadors showing up in the apartment of Svetlana Alexievich, the writer, the Nobel Prize winner, in order to support her. Even so, she is not really a typical representative of Belarusian opposition. She holds very confusing views about Belarusian identity vis-a-vis Russia and such, but still, the people who are making a stand, a symbolic stand, were the ambassadors of European countries. And also, I would say European countries mostly close to Belarus, really, of that region. But Ukraine didn't hurry up. Eventually, the Ukrainian foreign ministry did advise the president, and there was a statement that are not recognizing Lukashenko as a legitimate president, but Ukraine really followed in the steps of the West here. So once the United States and Canada and the UK and everybody around says that, then the Ukrainian foreign ministry, after waiting for appropriate time, repeats the statement. So it is reactive. I'm afraid Ukraine doesn't have a clear Belarusian policy in place. There was some kind of convoluted scheme by Ukrainian security services to get into Ukraine by way of Belarus, some Russian special commander who participated in the massacres on the Maidan, but that of course misfired because in part people working with Zelensky have loose lips, so too much was revealed too early. But I don't think Ukraine is a player. It has offered to take in Belarusians, but of course Poland did this even before Ukraine, and of course Poland would be a better choice, and Lithuania as well would be actually a more natural choice for the Belarusians escaping from the country. Ukraine is not in a position to be a major player in other country.
Thank you. Lucy, before we wrap up, I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask any remaining question that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that maybe Ukraine can't be a player in the situation in Belarus at the moment, but the playwright Andrei Korechyk, who's just written a play about the unfolding drama as it happens, which is being performed in places all over the world. He's now, he was on the coordinating council. I believe that he's now in Ukraine. Do you feel like the spirit of people that remember the battles that they fought, they can inspire people in Belarus, morally, artistically, sort of soulfully, with their spirit?
Yes, it definitely is a possibility. Whether this is what is in fact happening is a different question, because Belarus was for decades part of Russian informational space. So the word Maidan has a different meaning in Belarus than it has in Ukraine. And so many Ukrainian observers were shocked that the Belarusian protesters are saying that we are not going to have a Maidan here. But this is, of course, because they reference Maidan the way it functions in Russian political discourse. I should say that this is a belated revolution. This is something which should have happened in Belarus in 1991, or at least in 2004, when Ukraine was undergoing its own revolution. So it is a repetition of the same process, of the same evolution Ukraine has underwent. And Belarus will be there too, which I think is now inescapable. I mean, Lukashenko just cannot last for too long with this kind of policies, but also it is a threat to Russia. And it is a greater threat than Ukraine, because in Russia, they sort of gave up on Ukraine already. Okay, so Ukraine is lost. We are going therefore to assign it to the neo-Nazi category. But Belarus is not yet. And the striking parallels between Lukashenko and Putin, with like 2 decades in power and suppression of independent journalism and opinion, the parallels are striking. So if Lukashenko loses, then that's a clear signal for Mr. Putin. Even so, he dislikes Lukashenko, and there are all kinds of contradictions between the two allegedly united countries. But still, that would be a case for Russia to perceive as a defeat. And as I said, the nature of Mr. Putin's authoritarian rule is that it involves macho politics. You cannot be seen as defeated. So either they would have to symbolically separate from Belarus by saying that this is not the good government anyway, so let it go, or to accept that the same type of regime as exists in Russia was just defeated in Belarus, or is in the process of being defeated in Belarus. Both options are fairly difficult for Russia. And that's why the Belarusian case is so much more difficult.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting talking to you. I'm very sorry, everyone, about my dodgy Wi-Fi connection, by the way. I'm now sitting in the bedroom with my laptop. But thank you ever so much, Serhy. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. And
thank you, Lucy.
There's a link on how you can buy the book. So hope that you'll all do that.
Indeed, and thank you so much for this very enlightening discussion, Serhy Yekelchyk. I hope you'll be a guest at our future webinars. Again, there were so many questions we couldn't raise today, so hopefully these questions will be answered by your book. And Lucy Ash, thank you very, very much for
thank you so much for organizing it. And thank you, Lucy, for agreeing to participate. And thank you all the participants for great questions, including those I didn't have a chance to answer.
Indeed. Please buy the book. Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night.